The elevator rose in complete silence, its interior lined with velvet walls that swallowed every sound. Callie checked her reflection in the gold-framed mirror, heart thudding just a bit louder than she'd like. Her dress clung to her waist, black satin catching the elevator's dim light, her heels making her legs feel longer, braver. None of it was hers, borrowed from a friend, just like the confidence she tried to wear. When the doors slid open, she was met with floor-to-ceiling windows and a city that blinked, like it was breathing. Penthouse level, midnight sharp. Her instructions were clear. No talking unless spoken to, no questions, no touching unless asked. Be present, be silent, be still. She stepped inside. The suite was impossibly large, but quiet in a way that wasn't empty. More like waiting. A single floor lamp near the bar cast warm light over hardwood floors, polished to a mirror-like shine. The man stood by the far window, back turned to her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler of dark liquor he didn't seem to be drinking. Tall, broad-shouldered, not moving, not acknowledging her either. Callie closed the door softly behind her. She didn't speak, didn't ask, just crossed the room as she'd been trained to, keeping her posture effortless but poised, and took the seat near the fireplace unlit, modern, more design than function. Her fingers curled around her clutch. For a long moment, she did nothing, just breathed. Minutes passed. He didn't turn. She watched the outline of his back rigid, deliberate, the kind of man used to silence because silence didn't ask anything from him. Then finally, without turning around, he spoke. "Don't say anything," he said, voice low and measured. "Just stay." Callie gave a small nod, even though he couldn't see it, so she stayed, sat there in the dim quiet of a stranger's empire, surrounded by glass and steel and wealth that felt like another planet. Her back was straight, her hands calm in her lap, but inside, everything moved. This wasn't the first time she'd been paid to keep someone company, but it was the first time she wasn't sure if the man in the room even remembered she was human. 15 minutes, maybe 20. He didn't touch her, didn't turn to look, just stood there, shoulders squared like he was holding up the sky. Then he exhaled, slowly, as if something inside had unclenched just enough to breathe. He placed the untouched drink on the ledge near the glass. "You can go now," he said. Callie stood without a word, smoothing the folds of her dress. She walked toward the elevator. Just as her fingers reached for the call button, his voice stopped her again. "Same time tomorrow." She didn't turn around, didn't ask why, just nodded once. As the elevator closed behind her, she caught a glimpse of him at last in the reflection, the CEO behind the whispers, the rumors, the need for discretion. His face wasn't what she expected, not cruel, not cold, just tired, like someone who had everything and still couldn't sleep. The next night, when Callie stepped into the penthouse again, she knew how to walk, how to breathe. But that didn't mean it came naturally. Nothing in her life ever had. She hadn't grown up in glass towers or taken late-night elevators to floors without numbers. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat in South San Gabriel, where the scent of detergent never fully left the walls, and the neighbors felt loud enough to be part of bedtime stories. Her mother, Luciana, cleaned hotel rooms until her lungs gave out. Her father had left when she was 7, with a suitcase and a lie, "I'll send for you soon." He never did. By 14, Callie had learned how to stretch $5 into 3 meals. By 16, she was tutoring kids older than her just to bring home money for the rent. At 17, she graduated valedictorian with a full ride to a small liberal arts college. And for the first time, the world had felt possible. Then her mother died. It was sudden. A weak heart nobody saw coming. One hospital visit, one quiet beeping machine, and Callie found herself staring at her mother's still hand, with no idea how to move forward. Her little sister, Sophie, had only been 10. Callie dropped out. Someone had to be there. Someone had to pick up the prescriptions, argue with school administrators, fight with landlords, cook, clean, pay what little she could. Sophie was everything. And when Sophie got into a car accident on the way home from school at 16, Callie thought the world would break in two again. The hospital bills stacked higher than rent, and with no college degree, no real job prospects, and no time to chase internships, Callie turned to the one thing she still had, her ability to make people comfortable, seen, safe, needed. It started with small gigs, private dinner party hostessing, high-end events, short-term companionship for visiting clients, all arranged discreetly through a high society staffing agency. The money was real. The expectations were simple. No touching unless agreed. No sex unless she initiated. Callie never did. She wasn't there for that. What she offered, they said, was presence. She hated the word. It made her feel like furniture. But every time she saw Sophie's medicine costs, or the after-school tutor invoice, she reminded herself what it was really buying. Time, safety, a chance for her sister to have the life she never would. So when the agency called and said a high-tier client needed someone discreet, calm, professional, preferably able to keep their mouth shut, Callie said yes, no questions. The payout was double her rent, triple if he extended past the first meeting. He was rich, they said. Private, strange, maybe, but not dangerous. His name's Julius Thorne, the woman on the phone told her. If you're lucky, he won't speak. Just sit, and you get paid. Callie didn't feel lucky. The first night had left her curious, confused. The man hadn't touched her, hadn't looked at her, just wanted her. There. Most would think it easier than expected, but Callie knew better. People who didn't want anything were the ones you had to watch most closely. Because, deep down, they did. Back in the present, she smoothed the hem of her dress again as she walked into his suite for the second time. No greeting, no questions. Julius stood exactly where he had the night before, near the glass, staring down at the city like it might answer something he couldn't ask. She sat again. This time, she didn't look at him. Instead, her thoughts drifted to Sophie. Her sister had texted her earlier, asking if she'd be home tonight. Callie had said no. I have a client. Sophie never asked what kind. She didn't want to know, but sometimes Callie wondered if she already did. A chime broke the silence. Julius turned slightly, barely, then said, almost to himself, most people talk. Callie didn't reply. He turned his head a little more this time, not quite facing her, but enough to let her see the sharpness of his profile, clean jaw, high cheekbones, dark hair, slightly mussed, like he'd run his hand through it too many times. There was tiredness in his posture, but no fragility, just weight, like he was carrying something he had no intention of putting down. They filled the space with noise, he added. Callie's voice was quiet. I grew up where silence meant survival. His head shifted just a fraction, like he wasn't expecting her to speak, but he didn't stop her either. Noise meant something bad was coming, she continued. So I got good at listening and not interrupting. Another pause long. Then finally a breath. You're not like the others, he said. Callie gave a faint smile, though he couldn't see it. That's the point, isn't it? He didn't answer, but he didn't tell her to leave either. They sat there, two strangers with nothing to say, and too much unsaid, the city blinking around them, full of people who would never know that sometimes the most intimate thing you could do for someone wasn't touching their skin. It was sitting still long enough for them to feel seen. The third time Callie stepped into the penthouse, the stillness wrapped around her like a second skin. The air was clean, too clean, the lighting dimmed just enough to erase sharp edges. She knew this place now, knew the way her heels echoed on the polished floors, knew how the city lights reflected in the massive windows that made everything inside seem smaller. He stood in the same place as before, near the glass, his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other hanging loose by his side. The room hadn't changed, but something in the air had. There was no drink on the bar tonight, no music, no movement, just him and her, and the quiet that felt more like a presence than a lack. She walked to the chair by the fireplace, sat down without a word, and waited. She had learned by now that this man did not believe in greetings. He spoke only when it served a purpose. Tonight, he spoke. "There are rules," he said, his voice calm, low, like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest. She looked toward him, not directly. She waited. "I don't want small talk. I don't want stories about your day. I don't need company. I need quiet." He paused, then turning slightly, just enough for his voice to carry more clearly, he added, "No questions, no touching. Don't mistake this arrangement for intimacy. You're not here for that." Callie nodded, her voice steady when she replied, "Understood." He looked at her then, not long, just a flicker, enough to register that she meant what she said. Then he turned back to the window. His posture was unchanged, controlled, as if carved into stillness by years of practice. "You'd be surprised how hard silence is for most people," he said, eyes still focused somewhere far outside. "I wouldn't," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head slightly. She couldn't read his expression, but she could feel the pause in his breathing, the weight of attention shifting for just a second. "They fill the air with noise," he continued. Callie let the words settle. Then, softly, she said, "I grew up in a place where silence was survival." That made him turn more, not fully, just enough that she caught the outline of his face, sharp jawline, a mouth that looked like it had been silent longer than it had ever smiled. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, calm, watchful. "Noise meant something bad was coming," she said, "so I learned how to listen and how not to interrupt." He studied her, just briefly, then nodded once, almost to himself, and turned back toward the glass. "You're not like the others," he said. "That's the point, isn't it?" she replied. He said nothing after that. They sat like that for the rest of the hour, two people sharing a room, sharing no words, and somehow that meant more than any conversation Callie had had in months. She watched him in the reflection, how he never shifted weight, never let his shoulders drop. This wasn't comfort. This was tension mastered into silence. When the time came, she stood. "I'll let myself out," she said. "No," he replied. "Wait." He crossed to the bar, picked up a slim envelope, and handed it to her without fanfare. She looked at it. It was heavier than the last. "I didn't stay longer tonight," she said. "But you stayed right," he answered. She didn't ask what that meant. She had learned already that in this space, meaning was never handed over. It had to be felt. The next day, the agency sent a message. The client requested the same time for the next 3 nights. It wasn't usual. Repeat clients typically wanted more, wanted control, attention, validation. But Julius Thorne didn't want anything in the usual sense. What he wanted was something most people had long stopped offering. Presence without pressure. Company without questions. That night, when she returned, he was standing in the same spot. Nothing new, nothing changed. Until after 10 minutes, he spoke again. "Why don't you ask me who I am?" Callie looked up. Her answer was soft but firm. "You told me not to." He turned toward her more fully this time, his face in profile, defined, controlled. "And if I wanted you to ask anyway," he said, "then you would have left that out of the rules," she replied. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, just a breath of something less distant. He stepped closer. Not much, just enough to change the space between them, enough to change the air. You're not afraid of me?" He said, "No." "You should be." "Why?" He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. "You remind me of someone," he said at last, "but you're quieter." She didn't ask who. She didn't press. That night, when she left, there was no envelope on the table. Instead, Julius walked her to the elevator. His footsteps were soundless, measured. He didn't speak until the doors opened. "You'll come back tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a request, but something in his tone made it feel like a question all the same. Callie looked up at him and said simply, "Yes." The doors closed. Through the glass she caught a final glimpse of him, alone again, still watching the city, still pretending not to care. But she knew now. He didn't hire her because he wanted to be touched. He hired her because, maybe for the first time in a long time, he wanted to be seen. By the fourth night, Callie had stopped wondering what was expected of her. She no longer tried to decode the reasons behind the man's silence or the rules he clung to like armor. She simply arrived, took her place by the window or the edge of the sofa, and let the quiet settle in. It wasn't passive, not to her. It was a kind of communication in itself, a tension held between breaths. Julius didn't speak. He barely moved. He stood by the window most nights, gazing into the city like he was watching something only he could see. The penthouse around him was too clean, too precise, the kind of place designed by people who didn't live in it. No clutter, no warmth, just elegance and cold restraint. Callie brought a book that evening, one she had carried for years, its cover soft and edges worn. She didn't open it at first. She sat with it on her lap, hands resting on the pages, unsure if breaking the silence would undo whatever fragile balance had formed between them. After 15 minutes, he spoke. "You always carry that book." She looked up, surprised not by the observation, but by the fact that he chose to voice it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Do you ever read it?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, watching his reflection in the glass. "Mostly when I need to feel like I'm still part of something." "What kind of something?" Callie turned the book in her hands, the worn spine creasing gently in her fingers. "A story, a world, words that don't expect anything from me except to listen." He didn't respond at first. Then after a moment, he said, "Read something." It wasn't a question, but it also wasn't a command. Callie hesitated for a second, then opened to a page she knew well. Her voice was quiet at first, unsure if it would echo in a room so unused to sound. She read slowly, the rhythm of the words filling the space like candlelight. Julius didn't interrupt, he didn't turn, but his posture shifted, barely. Something in his stance softened, as if the words had reached under his skin and touched something too long buried to resist. When she finished the passage, she closed the book. Neither of them said anything, but when she stood to leave, he spoke again. "You have a good voice." She turned her head slightly. "For reading?" he added. She smiled, not fully, just enough to let him know she understood. The next night, she brought the book again. And the night after that, it became part of their pattern. He didn't always ask, but she always waited. Sometimes he'd nod. Other times, he would simply close his eyes and let the sound carry through the quiet like music only they could hear. One night, as a thunderstorm rolled in and cast long shadows through the tall windows, he finally asked what she had been wondering for days. "Why do you do this?" Callie looked up from the page. "This?" she asked. He nodded toward her book, her presence, the silence she offered so freely. "You could be somewhere else, doing something more typical for this kind of job." Callie closed the book gently and placed it on the table beside her. "I'm not good at pretending to be something I'm not," she said. "This is what I have to give. Stillness, attention, a kind of space no one ever offered me when I needed it most." He was silent for a long time after that. Then, without turning, he said, "Most people only give what they expect to get back." Callie tilted her head. "And what do you expect to get?" He didn't answer, but that night, when she stood to leave, he surprised her again. "Don't rush," he said. It was the gentlest thing he had said so far. So she didn't. She moved slowly, pausing at the door, her hand resting on the frame. The silence wasn't cold that night. It had changed, become something almost intimate, something she could step into without fear of vanishing. Each night after that felt different. The rules were still unspoken, but they were evolving. She noticed the subtle things, the way he no longer looked through her, but at her, the way he leaned slightly closer when she read, the way he sometimes closed his eyes, not from boredom, but as if the words helped him rest. One evening, she found him already seated, not by the window, but in the armchair across from where she usually sat. There was no drink, no phone, no distraction. He just looked at her and said, "Will you read again?" She did. Afterward, he asked, "Do you ever get tired of being quiet?" Callie thought for a moment. "No, silence isn't the absence of something. It's a choice, and sometimes it's the only thing I trust." He looked at her then, really looked, with something behind his eyes that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Callie didn't answer right away. "I don't think trust is the right word," she said slowly, "but I'm not afraid of you, and that matters more." He leaned back, watching her, like he was trying to memorize the shape of her silence. "I haven't let anyone stay this long in years," he admitted. Callie didn't ask why. She just opened her book again. That night, the city outside flickered with lightning. Inside, they sat across from each other, saying nothing. And yet, the room was full. For the first time, Julius wasn't the only one keeping something hidden. He just didn't know it yet. The penthouse no longer felt like unfamiliar ground. It wasn't home, not exactly, but it no longer pressed in on her like something foreign and forbidden. Callie had learned its rhythm. She knew the exact weight of the elevator's silence, the scent of the air before midnight, the way the city lights spilled in through the massive windows like liquid gold. She knew where to sit so that her presence could be felt without being intrusive, and she had learned to read the subtle shifts in Julius's posture, the near invisible ways he responded to her being there. She noticed how his shoulders sat lower when she spoke softly, how his eyes lingered for a breath longer when she turned a page, and how he no longer felt the need to fill the silence with distance. Still, he rarely spoke. Most nights passed without more than a few words, but the silence between them had transformed. It wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't empty. It was shared. And something in that quiet made her stay. Some nights she brought poetry. Other nights, a short story or a passage from a novel. Julius never commented on her choices, but Callie noticed the way he listened. Not passively, not as background noise. He listened the way people listen when they're starving for something they don't know how to ask for. Once, she read something that made her voice catch, a paragraph about loneliness, not being about the absence of people, but about the absence of being understood. When she looked up, she saw him staring out the window, unmoving except for his hands. One of them had curled into a fist. She didn't mention it. Another night, as rain tapped gently against the glass, he spoke before she could open her book. "How old were you when you realized no one was coming to save you?" The question wasn't meant to be answered aloud. She knew that, so she didn't. Instead, she closed the book and simply sat, hands folded in her lap, letting the rain speak for them both. That night, when she left, He walked her to the elevator again. As they waited, he asked, "Do you know how many people would call this pathetic?" "Do you?" she asked. "Yes." He paused. "And I don't care." Another evening, he asked her what she used to want. Not what she wanted now, what she used to want, back when she still believed in futures that weren't compromised. She told him she had wanted to teach literature, that she wanted to give kids the words that had once saved her. "I thought words were enough," she said quietly. Then life got louder. "And now?" he asked. "Now I just want my sister to be okay." He didn't respond, but his eyes stayed on her long after she finished speaking. The change was gradual but unmistakable. He started leaving the door open when she arrived, no longer waiting for her to knock. He began sitting before she did, offering her the seat closer to the fire, the one he had used for himself the first week. He no longer handed her envelopes at the end of the night. The agency still paid her, but the transaction no longer felt like payment for presence. It felt like gratitude that didn't know how to wear its name. Then came the night she arrived to find him sitting on the floor. It startled her, not because he looked out of place, he didn't, but because it was the first time she had seen him out of control, even slightly. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. His eyes were on the window, on the storm outside. When she approached quietly, he said, "The power went out. I didn't call for backup." She said nothing, just lowered herself to sit beside him. For a while, they watched the sky break open in silence. "I'm used to storms," he said after a while. "They remind me of being a child, of waiting for the world to end and wondering why it never did." Callie turned her head toward him. He wasn't looking at her, but she didn't need his eyes to hear the truth in his voice. "My mother used to sit in the dark when the power went out. No candles, no flashlights, just darkness. She said it was the only time the world matched how she felt inside." Callie spoke softly. "What about you?" "I pretended I liked it so she wouldn't feel alone." She nodded, not out of agreement, but understanding. They didn't speak again for the rest of the hour. They didn't need to. That night, when she stood to leave, he surprised her. "Callie." Her name from his mouth was a quiet thing, almost unsure. She turned. He stood slowly, stepped toward her, and for a second it seemed like he might reach for her hand, but he didn't. He just looked at her, something unspoken, flickering in his expression. "You make it quiet," he said, "but not empty." She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She simply nodded and stepped into the elevator. From that night forward, something shifted. The air between them changed. He still didn't touch her, still didn't ask for more than her presence. But Callie could feel it, the way gravity seemed to pull him slightly toward her each time she entered, the way he lingered at the end of the night, as if time with her had become something he didn't know how to part from. Callie wasn't sure what to call what was forming between them. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no declarations, no hunger in his eyes, no seduction in his voice, but it was intimacy nonetheless, raw and slow, and built not on what they said, but on what they never had to. She had been hired to fill a space. What she didn't expect was that space quietly reshaping itself around her. She wasn't sure if Julius knew it yet, but she did, and so she kept coming back. The invitation came without warning. It was a message sent through the agency just like all the others, only this time it included a different instruction. Formal evening attire required. Pick up at 7. Location, Thorn Industries Annual Investment Gala. Callie read the message twice, then once more, before placing the phone down on the table beside her. She had never been asked to attend anything public. Everything about her arrangement with Julius had lived in quiet corners, behind thick glass and private doors. This was different. This was exposure. That evening, a car arrived exactly on time. A driver in a black suit stepped out and opened the door without a word. Inside, The interior smelled faintly of leather and cold air. Julius was already seated, dressed in a dark navy tuxedo, cufflinks glinting against the low light. He didn't look at her as she slid in beside him, but she felt the shift in the air the moment she did. She wore a black silk gown, understated but elegant, borrowed again, with a neckline just modest enough to keep her posture guarded. "You clean up well," he said, eyes still forward. "So do you," she replied, his lips almost curved just once. Then silence took over again, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't heavy, just waiting. The gala was held in a downtown ballroom, a space of gold-trimmed ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and too much perfume. People turned when they walked in. Julius drew attention like gravity. Men greeted him with subtle deference. Women looked at him with practiced charm. And Callie, walking beside him, became an extension of that curiosity. She felt their stares. She knew what they wondered. She also knew she didn't care. Julius introduced her to no one. He didn't explain who she was or why she was there, but he never left her side. He placed his hand gently at her back as they moved through the room, guiding her with a lightness she hadn't expected. She didn't speak much at first, content to observe. The people around them spoke in numbers, in strategy, in alliances disguised as compliments. She listened, studied, absorbed. Then came the moment. They were seated at a round table near the front, surrounded by board members, investors, and a few familiar faces from the financial press. A man across the table, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, raised his glass toward Julius and said, "You've been quiet tonight, Thorne. Is that your new strategy? Letting your companion do the speaking?" The tone was light, but the edge was clear. Callie met his gaze without blinking. "Some things are more powerful when left unsaid," she said. "But if you're referring to the numbers in your latest prospectus, I'd suggest revisiting the second quarter projections. They don't align with the shifts in your supplier's international logistics." The table went silent. The man's brows lifted, caught off guard not just by her voice, but by the precision of what she said. Julius didn't react immediately. Then slowly, he turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable, except for the glint of something in his eyes. Not amusement, not pride, something closer to awe. The conversation shifted after that. People began addressing her directly, asking her thoughts, her insights. She responded calmly, clearly, always measured. She didn't overstep, but she didn't shrink either. And for the first time, Callie wasn't just seen as the woman beside Julius Thorne. She was seen as herself. Later, as the night wore on and the music softened into background hum, Julius led her to a quieter corner, near a tall window that looked out onto the city skyline. "That was unexpected," he said. "Which part?" she asked. "All of it." She tilted her head. "You brought me here." "Not to speak," he said. Then after a pause, "But I'm glad you did." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she often did when he wasn't watching. He looked tired beneath the polish, worn, not from the night, but from years. "You knew I wasn't just a body in a dress," she said, "or you wouldn't have brought me here." "I brought you here because I needed someone who wouldn't embarrass me." "You brought me here because I'm the only person who doesn't perform for you." He didn't deny it. He didn't need to. When they returned to the penthouse that night, she didn't sit in her usual place. She stood by the window, where he usually stood, watching the lights of the city flicker like old film. He stood a few feet behind her, silent. Then she said, without turning, "Did you bring me there to test me?" "Maybe," he said. "And?" "You passed." She turned to face him. "That wasn't a test for me. That was a test for you." "And how did I do?" he asked. She gave a half smile. "You didn't flinch?" He stepped closer, not quite touching, but closer than ever before. The air between them was warm. Unspoken things moved in it, quiet but undeniable. "This thing between us," he began, then stopped. "It's not part of the rules." "No," she said, "but we stopped following those a long time ago." He didn't reply, but he didn't step back either, and for Callie, that was enough. In the days following the gala, something changed between them, not abruptly, not in any way obvious to the outside world, but in the quiet, subtle ways that only they would notice. Julius no longer waited for Callie to sit before speaking. Sometimes he'd already be talking when she walked in, as if he trusted her enough now to let her arrive in the middle of a thought. And Callie no longer felt the need to wait for permission. She brought books still, but sometimes she didn't read. Sometimes they just talked, though it was never small talk, never surface level. It was always something with weight, something real. One night, she asked him about a scar on his wrist, thin and pale, nearly hidden beneath the cuff of his shirt. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "Boarding school, glass door." I didn't cry. She didn't press. He never liked when things were pushed too far. Another night, he asked her what made her stay. Not just with him, but in this city, in this life, in the hard places where people like her weren't meant to last. "My sister," she said. "She still believes people are good, and I want her to be right." He nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense in a way nothing else ever had. Their conversations began to stretch longer than the hours she was paid for. Some nights she left after midnight, some just before dawn. It wasn't about the clock anymore. It was about presence. It was about what happened when the rest of the world went quiet, and they didn't have to be anyone but themselves. Once, after she read him a passage from an old essay about fear and control, he sat in silence for a long time before saying, "I don't let people close because the ones I did let in either left or turned that closeness into something sharp." Callie closed the book and looked at him. "I don't need close. I just need truth." He stared at her like he didn't know what to do with that. One evening, after a long day of meetings he wouldn't discuss, he poured himself a glass of scotch and then another for her, though she rarely drank. He handed it to her with quiet fingers, their hands brushing for the briefest moment. She felt the contact, like heat. He didn't pull away. He held her gaze for a second longer than usual and said, "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she replied. He sat beside her that night, not across from her, not near the window or by the fire, but next to her on the couch where they had never shared space before. Their knees almost touched. His breathing was even, but she could sense the tension behind it, like he was trying to keep something inside from breaking free. "Can I ask something?" she said. "If I say no, will you ask anyway?" "No." He paused, glanced at her, and said, "Then ask." She looked straight ahead when she said it. "Have you ever been in love?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low, quiet in a different way. "Once, a long time ago, before I learned what it costs." She turned her head slightly toward him. "And what does it cost?" "Control, and everything after." The silence stretched again, but this one didn't need to be filled. It was heavy, but not uncomfortable. When he stood to leave the room, she thought the moment had passed, but then, at the doorway, he turned back to her and said, "It's not that I'm incapable of love, Callie. It's that I don't trust what it makes me want." She didn't respond, but the look she gave him said everything he wasn't ready to hear. On another night, she fell asleep on the sofa. Not deeply, just long enough for the sound of his voice to wake her. "You should go home," he said softly. She sat up slowly, eyes blinking away sleep. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "You're fine," he said quickly. "It's just late." But he didn't rush her. He stood there watching her gather her things, the way someone watches something fragile, not because they're afraid it will break, but because they're afraid they will. As she slipped on her shoes, he added, You looked peaceful." "I was," she said. "It's strange, but I never really sleep anywhere. Not deeply. But here—" She trailed off. He didn't need her to finish. "I know," he said. He stepped aside to let her pass, and for the first time, as she walked by, he reached out and gently brushed something off her shoulder. It was nothing, really. A gesture so small it could have been dismissed. But Callie felt it like thunder, because that was the moment she realized he was no longer holding back out of habit. He was holding back because he didn't know how not to. Before the elevator doors closed, he said her name again, not as a statement, not as a command, just a name suspended in the space between them. She didn't answer with words, just a look, just a pause, and when she stepped inside and the door slid shut, she knew he was still standing there, watching, listening to the silence they had built, and maybe, just maybe, wishing it could say something more. It started with a headline, a photo first, grainy and tilted, taken from somewhere high and hidden, showing a man in a tailored suit handing a black envelope to a woman in a dark dress. There were no names, just a caption laced with insinuation. "Powerful CEO in midnight exchange with unknown woman. Sources say it's not business." Callie saw it by accident. She was standing in line at a corner cafe scrolling through her phone while waiting for her tea, when her name popped up in a comment thread below the post. Not directly, but clearly. "Isn't that the girl who was at the gala with Julius Thorne? Looks like his new toy. He changes assistants the way people change shirts." The chill that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the weather. She didn't move, didn't blink, just kept reading, her fingers tight around the phone. By the time she returned to her apartment, the article had already been picked up by 2 other blogs. One was worse than the first. It implied payment, transaction. Words like companion and arrangement were thrown around freely, and though no facts were presented, the photos spoke louder than any truth she could offer. The worst part wasn't that she was mentioned. It was that they didn't even need to use her name. Just enough clues, just enough image. The implication alone did the damage. When she arrived at the penthouse that night, she wasn't sure what to expect. She stepped inside with her head high, her shoulders square, pretending calm. But the silence felt different. Too clean, too sharp. Julius was standing by the window as usual, but he didn't turn, not immediately. "You saw it," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "Of course I saw it," she replied. "Everyone saw it." He turned then, slowly, eyes scanning her face as if searching for something she hadn't said yet. "It's not true." "No, but it doesn't matter, does it?" He looked away, his jaw flexed once, then stilled. "It matters to me." She stepped closer, her voice quieter now, not angry, but tired. "You gave me that card. You hired me without even knowing my name. You started this, and then you just let it happen." "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "That I'm sorry?" "No," she said. "I want to know why. Why you didn't say anything. Why you let them tell my story for me." He didn't answer, not right away. When he finally did, his voice was almost a whisper. "Because I didn't want to make it worse. Anything I said would have added fuel. And because—" He paused. "Because I wasn't sure if you would still want to be part of this after what they said." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the man who had everything under control, but the man who had spent years hiding behind it. "You could have asked me," she said. "You could have trusted that I can survive worse than whispers." His eyes met hers, and there it was again, that flicker of something like regret. She stepped back. "I don't want your apology. I just want the truth. Why did you really hire me? Julius? Why me?" He didn't move. He didn't blink. "Because when I handed you that card and you didn't fall apart, I knew you were the only person in this entire world who might not be afraid of me." "That's not a reason," she said. "It is to me." Her voice was steady. "Well, it's not enough for me." She turned then, walked toward the elevator. He didn't stop her, but something in his face shifted, like he had finally realized what it meant to lose something you never dared admit you wanted in the first place. She left without looking back. The next morning, Callie didn't go to the penthouse. She didn't call. She didn't answer messages. She simply disappeared from the life that had almost become routine, and Julius, for the first time in a long time, was left alone in a room that no longer felt quiet, only hollow. The envelope she had left behind still sat unopened on the table. Her voice, her presence, the weight of her silences, all of it gone. And this time, he had no one to blame but himself. He spent the next few days immersed in crisis management. The article had grown teeth. Investors were nervous. Press teams were working around the clock. Legal sent out cease and desist letters. Public relations crafted statements and denials, carefully worded to distance him from the rumor without drawing more attention. None of it mattered. The damage wasn't on the outside. It wasn't about his name or his reputation. It was about the one person who had walked into his world without asking for anything and now had walked away, not because she had to, but because he had let her believe she didn't matter enough to protect. He didn't sleep. He stopped drinking. He sat in his office at 3 a.m, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass, wondering how someone who had mastered control could be so careless with something so fragile. On the 5th day, his security chief brought him a file. Internal traces, metadata, leak patterns. The source had been found. It hadn't been a journalist. It hadn't been an outsider. It had been Evelyn Vale. She had accessed old PR credentials, used dormant credentials to send the image, and pitched the story anonymously to 3 different blogs. Her motive wasn't profit. It was revenge, for being replaced, for being erased, for watching Callie walk beside him in a way she had never been allowed to. Julius read the evidence in silence. Then he closed the file, stood up, and made 3 quiet phone calls. Within 48 hours, Evelyn's name was removed from every project under his umbrella. Her consulting firm was dropped without a public explanation. No press, no spectacle, just silence. In his world, that kind of silence was the most brutal consequence of all. But even with the truth in hand, the files closed, and the scandal buried, he still didn't have what he needed most. Callie. He searched through internal records, traced the car service she last used, cross-referenced the billing address she had listed through the agency. It led him to a small independent bookstore on the edge of the city, the kind of place where nothing cost more than $15, and the lights were warm even when the weather wasn't. He didn't send anyone. He drove himself. It was late afternoon when he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. She was there, behind the counter, wearing a simple sweater, her hair tied back, a book open in front of her. She looked up, and for a moment she didn't move. He stood there quietly, letting her look at him, letting her decide what happened next. "How did you find me?" she asked finally. His voice was calm, but there was something raw in it. "You left the car lease under my system profile. You forgot to change it." She closed the book. "That doesn't sound like me." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He stepped closer but didn't approach the counter. "I know who leaked it. I have the proof. It was Evelyn. I released a full internal report. You've been cleared. Officially, publicly." "That doesn't clear the silence," she said. He nodded. "I know." They stood there, the air between them fragile. Then quietly he said, "I'm not good at this. I know how to manage outcomes. I know how to prevent risk. But I don't know how to lose people, or how to keep them for the right reasons." She crossed her arms, watching him. "I never asked you to keep me." "I know," he said again. "That's why I want you back." Her expression didn't soften, not yet. "You can't just say that like it's an offer." "It's not," he replied. "It's a hope." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since the day they met, he looked like a man without a shield. There was no suit of armor, no calculated distance, no script, just Julius, the man behind the silence. Callie stood there for a long time, her arms crossed, staring at Julius. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was weighted with everything they had shared, everything they had lost, and everything they still could be. The noise of the world outside faded, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat, steady and calm, as if it knew what was at stake. Finally, she spoke. "You're right. You didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't ask you to love me. But you did. And now you have to prove that you understand what that really means." Julius nodded, his throat tight. "I've spent my whole life thinking I could control everything. My company, my future, my relationships. But with you, Callie, I found something I didn't want to control. I didn't want to fix it or mold it to fit into a blueprint. I just wanted to let it be. And I ruined it." She raised an eyebrow. "You ruined it?" "Yes," he said. "I let fear, insecurity, and pride cloud everything. I hurt you, and I let you believe you weren't enough when you've always been more than anyone could ever dream of." His eyes were searching hers, trying to convey the sincerity of the apology he had never thought he needed to say until now. Callie took a deep breath, and for the first time, she softened. "You're not the only one who made mistakes, Julius. I left without a word. I ran from the one thing that could have been good in my life because I was afraid. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of your world swallowing me whole." Julius took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you back, Callie. Not because I need you to save me. Not because you make me look good. But because I love you. And for the first time, I know what that really means." There it was, the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of pride and fear, the words that had been so hard to say but now came out with such clarity. Love. Not as a possession, not as something to be controlled, but as something shared, something that could heal wounds and break barriers. Callie's eyes glistened, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm, the soft pressure of her fingers against his skin, reminding him that she had once been there, always present, always ready to love him, even when he didn't deserve it. "You have a lot to prove," she said quietly, "not just to me, but to yourself." "I know," he replied, "and I'm ready to prove it, every day, for as long as it takes." There was a pause, the air charged with anticipation, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, Callie smiled, the kind of smile that made Julius feel like he had just been given a second chance at everything. A smile that said she was willing to try, just like he was. "All right," she said, her voice softer now, filled with warmth. "Let's start over, but this time, it's on my terms." Julius couldn't help but smile back. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the evening light filtered in through the bookstore windows, casting a warm glow over their faces, Julius realized that he had learned something invaluable in the last few days. Love wasn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It was about being vulnerable enough to admit your faults, brave enough to ask for forgiveness, and strong enough to give someone the space to heal alongside you. And so, together, they took the first step toward a new beginning. A beginning built not on power, not on status, but on love and respect for each other as equals. No more masks, no more pretense. Just two people, imperfect but willing to make it work. Callie's heart had been broken, but now it was slowly being healed by the one person who could fix it. And Julius, for the first time in his life, felt complete. not because he had everything, but because he had found the one thing worth everything. And that, he realized, was all that mattered.